Let's look at flowers. Sounds pleasant. Be able to define flower, sepal, petal, stamen, anther, stigma, carpel, and ovule. Be able to relate flowers to the alternation of generations. Explain the ABC model of flower genetics and identify each of the 5 plant families that we covered earlier by their flower. Now, I wasn't going to have you guys look up and draw flowers in class, but let's just kind of go over this as a lecture. So first you have the stamen. The stamen is going to be the male parts of the flower, and it is consistent of 2 different parts, the anther and the filament. The filament is kind of like the petiole of a leaf. It is a long stem-like thing. The anther is going to contain the male gametophytes, i.e. the pollen grains, and that's going to be at the end of the filament. Then you have the carpel. This is the female parts of the flower. There is the stigma, which is a surface where pollen is going to land and germinate. The style, which is going to connect the stigma to the ovary, and that is where the pollen tube is going to grow through the style. And then the ovary, which is going to contain 1 or more ovules, which will have embryo sacs in them. Those will, when fertilized, become seeds. Outside of these reproductive parts, you have the petals, and the petals are what are going to give the flower its color and display. Below these are the sepals. These are leaf-like things that are below the petals and often are not very decorative. Now, how does this connect to the alternation of generations? Remember gametophytes. This is the parts of the flower that make the gametes, and they're going to be the pollen grains, which make the sperm, and the embryo sac, which makes the egg. Where is the pollen found? That's right. You look back up here, it's the anther. Where is the embryo sac found? That's right. You look back up here, it's in the ovule, which is in a carpel. The sporophyte is everything else besides those pollen grains and embryo sacs. So looking back at the flower, everything that is not a pollen grain or an embryo sac is a sporophyte cell. And the spores are going to be made in the anthers and the carpels, which will give rise to the gametophytes. So why do flowers exist? Well, they exist to move pollen between plants. These are a plant's reproductive organ, and their goal is to get pollen out of them or get pollen from other plants. So here we have a night blooming cactus that is going to be attractive to a bat. So this is going to have some nectar, and the bat wants the nectar, so it's going to go face first into that flower. Now, as it goes face first into that flower, it's going to get coated with pollen. No worries, the bat is then going to go to the next flower and go face first into that, depositing pollen from the previous flower onto the next, and getting flower from the next flower, which will be deposited on another one. So pollinators are going to be moving pollen around. But I want you to stop and think for a moment that grasses do not have pollinators. What they do is they put their pollen out in the wind, and then they collect pollen from the wind on their stigmas. How are flowers developed? Well, this is the ABC model. So flowers are just a bunch of leaves. It's a very tight whorl of leaves. What makes them different is the expression of certain genes. The A gene alone is going to cause these leaves to become sepals in the whorl that's called the calyx. The A gene plus the B gene will cause those flowers to become petals. The B gene plus the C gene causes those to become stamens. And then the C gene alone makes the carpels. Now, these genes are only expressed when other genes are turned on, and you can actually induce those other genes to make flowers. It's kind of some cool science going on here. What I want you to take out of this is that there's a combination of genes, and there's a certain context that is going to be ready for a flower, because we're going to look at how day length causes plants to go into their flowering mode, or maturity causes plants to choose to flower. And flowers define plant families. I want you to go back to Unit 1 and look at the flowers that we covered in the 5 different plant families. In class, we're going to draw these on the board. At home, I would ask you to try to draw a flower from each of the plant families.